All right, let's dive into some really fascinating legal puzzles. Today, we're going to take what look like complex flashcards and turn them into clear, simple ideas. Ideas about the rules that shape, well, pretty much everything we do. Okay, let's get started.
So, let's kick things off with a question you've probably wondered about yourself. Picture it. A kid, a big hardware store, an accident. Who's on the hook? Believe it or not, this one little scenario cracks open a huge area of law. And don't worry, we'll circle back and give you a clear answer on this one. Okay, so to figure out puzzles like that one, you first got to know which rule book you're playing with. And today, we're looking at two of the biggest. On one side, you've got tort law. Think of this as the rule book for all the messy, unexpected things that go wrong between people. And on the other side, contract law. That's for when people make formal promises and then, well, break them.
So here's the game plan. We're going to start in the sometimes chaotic world of torts, looking at accidents and responsibilities. Then we'll switch gears completely and jump into the more structured world of contracts, how deals are made and what happens when they completely fall apart.
First up, Section 1, Torts, Accidents, and Injuries. This is all about that one big question. When something goes terribly wrong, who ends up paying for it?
Let's make this real. Imagine you buy a brand new kettle. You plug it in and boom, it explodes and you get hurt. Now, it seems like a no-brainer, right? The company that made it should be responsible. But what does the law actually need to see to make that happen?
So, the law has this really powerful tool for situations like this. It's called strict liability. And it basically means you don't have to prove the company was being sloppy or careless. Nope. All you got to show is three things. 1, the product was defective. 2, that defect caused the damage. And 3, its safety was just not what any reasonable person would expect. And, an exploding kettle is a pretty clear fail on that last point.
And that means the takeaway here is pretty straightforward. The explosion itself is the proof. That puts the producer right on the hook. It's a really important piece of protection for every single one of us.
Okay, let's build on that. For our next section, we're shifting from faulty products to the duties we owe each other in actual physical spaces. If you own a property, what exactly are your responsibilities to the people who come onto it?
And here we are, right back to our opening puzzle. A kid gets hurt in a store. Now your gut reaction might be, well, where were the parents? But the law, specifically something called occupier's liability, it looks at this whole thing very differently, especially when a child is involved.
See, the bar is set way higher here. An owner has to expect that kids are going to be, well, kids. They're not as careful. And this brings up this really fascinating legal idea called an allurement. Basically, something that's just too tempting for a curious kid to ignore. That wobbly stack of tiles, it's a perfect example. Because that's a predictable risk, the store is probably on the hook for not making that space reasonably safe for its youngest visitors.
Okay, that makes sense for a customer. But what if the person on your property wasn't even invited? Let's tweak the story a bit. Instead of a kid in a store, picture teenagers sneaking onto a closed construction site. They're trespassers. Does the owner still owe them any kind of protection?
The law says, surprisingly, yes, but it's a different, more limited kind of duty. The test for trespassers really boils down to 3 key questions for the owner. Are you aware of the danger, like, say, that unguarded scaffolding? Do you know people might be trespassing near it, maybe because of that gap in the fence? And is it a risk you should reasonably do something to protect them from? If the answer is yes to all 3, the owner still has a duty of care.
Before we say goodbye to torts, let's clear up a super common mix-up: the difference between damaging someone's reputation and invading their privacy. Defamation is all about protecting you from damaging lies, but misuse of private information, that's about protecting personal stuff, even if it's 100% true. And that's the absolute key takeaway here. Just because something is true doesn't automatically give you the right to publish it.
All right, let's leave the world of accidents and injuries behind and step into the world of agreements. Section 3 is all about what it actually takes to make a promise legally stick. You see this all the time in business. 2 sides sketch out the basics of a deal. It's in a document called Heads of Terms. It looks official, it's signed, but there are a couple of key details missing, and a very important phrase in there. So, is this a done deal? Is it a legally binding contract?
And the answer is a big, clear no, not yet. For a contract to be real, it needs certainty on all the super important stuff, like price. And that little phrase, subject to contract, That's like a giant flashing sign to the courts that says, hey, we don't plan on this being legally real until we sign the final formal document.
But what about promises made in good faith that aren't part of some fancy contract? Because that happens all the time. Imagine a landlord sees their tenant is really struggling, so they say, hey, just pay me reduced rent for a while. The tenant relies on that promise. Can the landlord then just suddenly change their mind and demand all the back rent?
This is where a really cool legal principle of fairness comes into play. It's called promissory estoppel. It can literally estop or stop the landlord from going back on their promise. And the best way to remember it is with this classic line. It's a shield, not a sword. The tenant can use it to defend themselves against the landlord's claim, but they can't use it as a weapon to, say, sue the landlord for a new contract.
All right, time for our final section. We've seen how deals get made. Now let's talk about what happens when they get broken.
Check this out. A contract has a clause that says if a delivery is late, even by a single day, the supplier has to pay a whopping £100,000. It's meant to scare them into being on time. But is that even legal? Is it enforceable? This is where the courts step in and draw a line in the sand between a fair payment for a loss and what they call an illegal penalty clause. The modern test asks, is this fee just completely over the top, totally out of proportion to any real damage the delay caused? A huge flat fee like that looks a lot more like a punishment than a real estimate of the loss, and courts will usually throw those kinds of clauses out. And finally, what happens when something totally out of left field blows up a contract, like a pandemic or a war? Well, there are two main ways the law looks at this. Force majeure is a clause that you write into the contract to plan ahead for these kinds of disasters. Frustration is a legal idea that kicks in when you don't plan for them. And the lesson here is crystal clear. A well-written contract with a good force majeure clause is almost always better than relying on the default rules of the law. And that wraps up our tour through these legal puzzles. From an exploding kettle to a broken promise, what we've really seen is this constant balancing act. The law is always trying to juggle personal responsibility, our freedom to make deals, and just plain fairness. So after seeing how all these pieces fit together, you have to ask yourself, do you think the law gets that difficult balance right?